Hello and welcome to today's special webinar event on how to achieve file storage resiliency with Nutanix and Commvault. On this event, you'll learn how Nutanix files integrate with the Commvault Complete Backup and Recovery solution. My name is David Davis from Actual Tech Media, and I'm excited to be your moderator on today's event. Today's event is sponsored by Nutanix and Commvault. Now, before we get started, we have a little bit of housekeeping here to cover. On today's event, you'll hear from Mr. Devin Helms, marketing strategist at Nutanix, and Mr. Sam Grover, product manager for virtualization at Commvault. Just a little bit of housekeeping here on the interface and how the event will flow. First off, we want this to be a very educational event. This isn't just to throw out a bunch of speeds and feeds to you. We want to get your questions in. We want to help answer those questions, and we have our experts on standby to do that. We also want to hear about your real world challenges and how you might be struggling with file storage and data protection, and we're here to help solve those challenges. So we encourage you to use the GoToWebinar questions box there to ask as many questions as you'd like, and we'll be having a dedicated Q&A session at the end of today's presentation. We also want to point out that I'll be announcing one lucky prize winner on today's live event. That's for a $300 Tango gift card. And that if the live event has passed, if you're watching this on demand, I'm sorry, the drawing has already occurred. If you'd like to look up the official prize terms and conditions for that drawing, you can find those at events.actualtechmedia.com. And with that, I'll hand it over to our first presenter, and that is Mr. Devin Helms. Take it away, Devin.
Good morning, everybody. This is actually Sam. I'm going to start. I want to thank everybody for joining. And good morning, Devin.
Good morning, Sam.
I see you've got some charts on data growth here.
I do. And by now, I think this is probably motherhood and apple pie for most people, because I think we all agree that massive data growth, particularly year-on-year data growth, is the norm. And 80% is not an uncommon number to see for data growth.
We hear that from our Commvault customers all the time as well. And it's not just about data growth. It's about the growth of business critical data as well, right?
Yeah, absolutely. One area that my team in Nutanix is keenly interested in is the growth in the unstructured data, which is some of the most critical business data that you've got. And as I mentioned, something that surprises a lot of people is that unstructured data actually accounts for 80% of all data stored. So it's a significant portion.
Yeah, it is. Where's it all coming from?
That's also an interesting development. It used to be that most of file and object data came from users creating documents and storing media files. And that's still a significant portion of the data that's being created out there. But according to a December report by IDC, sources of file and object data are increasing. So now we have applications that are creating data. This is things like automated healthcare systems or telemetry systems or camera and security systems. There's a lot of different applications that can create that data. We also have data that's being created by edge systems and IoT systems. And what's interesting is that those end up being larger creators of data. In fact, by 2025, IDC thinks that it's going to be about 200 zettabytes worth of data created that year. And as you can see on this chart, a lot of that is those edge IoT systems and application data. So 60% of this is typically considered to be object data, and then 40% is typically considered to be file data. So there is a mix of the types of technology used. And something interesting that's been happening for a while now is that with the rise of cloud, there's the expectation that about 49% of all of this data is expected to be born on and live out on the cloud.
Wow, that's a massive amount of data to be sure. So I'd imagine all of this is a management problem.
It is, and we hear that from customers all the time. And it's not just from customers, but we're hearing it from press and analyst community that this massive data growth is causing a management problem. And this is just one of a few key trends that's making it difficult. So keeping data available and accessible, the first is obviously massive scale is a problem. Two of the other key trends that we hear about a lot are rise of governance and control requirements and the second being the rise of new architectures, specifically cloud. The cloud consumed different ways, whether that's on-prem or hybrid, or born on the cloud, sometimes called cloud first, or even sort of a multi-cloud point of view. And what makes this challenge even greater is that a lot of people are dealing with this on antiquated legacy infrastructure that wasn't built for these new realities in mind. So let's talk a little bit about how this impacts file storage. You know, as we already discussed, file and data growth is a significant and continuous problem. But the problem is that legacy infrastructure is complex and siloed. And that means that administrators spend more of their time on break-fix operations and less time delivering data to the users and applications who need it. They also spend more of their time learning and managing across different storage silos and different storage interfaces. And they have a harder time planning for the future and consumption with accuracy, because these systems don't scale well without disruption and forklift upgrades. And they're not flexible enough to serve the new and unexpected needs that rise as business needs change. A second trend that we're hearing a lot about is the increasing scrutiny of file data, all unstructured data, but especially file data. GDPR, for example, was released about a year ago, just a little over a year ago. And already we're seeing other geographies model privacy requirements that use that as a standard. In fact, I'm in San Francisco right now. California is adopting wholesale sections of GDPR in the way that they operate. And not just California, but across the United States and across a lot of other geos, compliance standards like GDPR are on the rise. But even if it wasn't for government-mandated compliance issues, companies have their own internal GRC initiatives, because at the end of the day, it's their data and their responsibility to protect it and to keep it available. So the challenges here really are around keeping data available in a way that is repeatable, predictable, and using automation to make that data available. Another challenge is around visibility, being able to understand the data about the data that's on your system. And frankly, legacy systems don't have the kind of visibility and lack a lot of the automation capabilities that modern file storage systems require. Excuse me. And then the third trend that we hear about all the time, obviously, is cloud. For some organizations, adoption makes sense for the way that they do business. For others, they're changing the way they operate to make better use of these new architectures. But heavy metal systems weren't built for these new architectures. They were built for the on-prem era. And so no matter how they try to retrofit themselves, they can't truly achieve cloud-like architectures, and they can't include cloud as part of the on-prem infrastructure to provide one single hybrid infrastructure. So what we've done at Nutanix as a whole, as part of our pioneering of the HCI technology, is to break down silos and make infrastructure invisible. And that means simple instead of complex. It means data aware instead of heavy metal. And it means to become truly a standard for enterprise cloud and organizations. A couple of years ago, we started looking closely at the file storage problem. And we realized that our philosophy would help solve many of the problems that the file data side of the business sees as well. So we introduced Nutanix Files. It's a simple, flexible, and intelligent file storage and management system for the enterprise cloud. So to address massive data growth is one of the challenges that we mentioned. Nutanix Files is built to be simple. It provides a single pane of glass interface that integrates with the Nutanix HCI management interface. It includes self-healing and self-tuning capabilities so that administrators can spend less time on break-fix operations. And because you can deploy file, object, and block from the same infrastructure, it breaks down a lot of those silos that create complexity and make planning for the future difficult.
That's pretty cool. You can do file, object, and block all from the same infrastructure. That's really flexible.
Yeah, it varies. In fact, so it leverages the Nutanix HCI stack to create file clusters. But that same hardware, those same nodes and those same clusters can host your applications and block storage on Nutanix AOS environments. You can also host your VMware or your Hyper-V or your AHV virtualization on that same platform, as well as your file and object. So any of the different technologies that you need to deploy, you can deploy from that same platform. And of course, as you know, deep integration with data protection is critical. And so we have deep integration with Commvault for protection of the entire stack from one single environment. The second issue, of course, we talked about is compliance. And from a compliance perspective, Files includes automation at every step of the infrastructure. We already mentioned self-healing and self-tuning capabilities, which leverage automation to monitor performance for potential problems and automatically scale up or scale out to resolve hotspots, or automatically move workloads to remediate problems before they become bigger issues. But in addition to that, Nutanix Files leverages APIs across the infrastructure to allow for automation of many of the different management activities for consistency each time. So in addition to automation, the other element for compliance that's really necessary is deep integration with data visibility. And Nutanix Files offers a unique, fully integrated data analytics engine and a front-end interface to give you vast amounts of data about your data. So you can understand capacity and how it's being used and by whom. You can see permissions changes over time. You can see violations over time. And you can even set up rules to detect anomalies such as mass deletion and mass change activities. And in future versions of the analytics engine, because it's integrated, you'll actually be able to automate responses to some of these anomalies. So take action when some of these anomalies come up. And then finally, from a cloud perspective, Nutanix Files is a software-defined file storage solution. So that means that it allows architects to use a wide array of hardware, or as I mentioned, even host it as part of their existing HCI infrastructure. It uses pay-for-what-you-use capacity-based licensing, just like cloud models. And like clouds, it's designed for non-disruptive scale-up and scale-out of resources for applications and file storage, so that your users can continue working on their day-to-day activities without interruption when you need to scale. So as unstructured data continues to grow in volume and business criticality, my question, Sam, to you is, how do you protect something that's just too big to fail?
That's a great question. And it's a major problem for businesses today. As file sets grow exponentially, creating distinct copies of those data sets becomes increasingly difficult, right? So traditional backup approaches for extremely large data sets will fail. So the first line of defense is often simple snapshots, creating point-in-time copies of the file system within the storage or file system layer. When keeping all of that in one system feels a little risky, people branch out a little bit and they start performing platform-based replication to offer another layer of protection. This provides great disaster recovery copies in case something goes wrong with the primary platform, but you open yourself up to a host of other concerns.
Yeah, that makes sense. But what other kinds of customers' concerns are there beyond just replication?
Primarily, it's that one-to-one relationship between the source copy and the destination, right? So anything created on the source is replicated directly to the destination. This fact allows the replica to be vulnerable to manual errors, right? Human errors of accidentally deleting or modifying large chunks of the data set, or even corruption that propagates along the replication path. And then worse yet, the specter of ransomware and viruses can definitely impact a replication-only strategy. With no real barrier between the two sides, any bad data that shows up on the source will definitely make its way over to the recovery side.
Sure, I can see how that's a major concern for customers. You know, that recovery side's often the main way they expect to recover from an issue. Is there anything else your customers express concern over with replication-based protection?
Sure. The final concern is a consequence of the process, right? But one that most people never have to worry about or hope to never have to worry about. As I was preparing for the session, it dawned on me that Nutanix is kind of the automaker, excited to put out new technology and new vehicles and show everything off at the yearly auto show for everyone to go ooh and ah over. And then Commvault, as we tend to be, come in and we're the insurance company, right? We're worried whether or not the shiny new car is protected and recoverable. And it's this final piece that's our major concern for our customers. Your data set's too big to fail, but that also likely means that it's too big to recover over the wire or be made available from that secondary location in the case of limited resources, right? So when we start to look at native protection options within Nutanix and where we saw our opportunity, you know, the built-in operations follow what we see customers moving along, right? That initial snapshot in order to be able to protect your file share, moving on to replication between clusters, even being able to do some level of recovery within the GUI there within Prism, right? Being able to self-service those restores as needed. Some of those things obviously can help mitigate some of the basic protection concerns.
Yeah, I think Nutanix has done a great job at providing some first stage data protection or replication capabilities, but I imagine that there's a lot that Commvault can do to help expand protection, particularly for file customers.
Absolutely. So Commvault Data Protection Platform is designed to scale to your business needs, right? As your workload, in this case files, expands, Commvault can expand alongside it to ensure complete data protection coverage for all of your critical business data. We're even happy to protect your non-business critical data too, if you'd like us to. Commvault can automatically discover your file shares, apply data protection policies to those shares, and automatically tier that data in whichever ways the business requires. This can include local copies to the Nutanix file platform, a secondary Nutanix platform somewhere, even Commvault hyperscale, or any combination of data mover and storage you choose. Additionally, we can tier the data from your primary location to any or multiple secondary locations using any platform mentioned above, or even cloud targets like Nutanix buckets, or public cloud targets like AWS, GCP, or Azure.
Mm-hmm. So, it's interesting that you say that, because for files, simple, flexible, and intelligent are the key value pillars. And that really does seem like a very flexible approach. Does the tiering introduce any recoverability issues within the system?
No. Commvault maintains a dynamic index of what copies exist and where they exist, so that an administrator or an end user can simply choose to recover whatever data they need to from whichever copy. They simply, by default, will recover from the first copy, but they can move to any copy they need to, depending on their current business scenario, right? And then one thing we kept in mind during all of this integration was simplicity, right? Over the years, we've watched you guys at Nutanix really drive home that simplicity and configuration through one click. And for Commvault, we haven't quite gotten that far for files integration, but we're making headways. And we've tried to minimize the number of clicks required to go from no protection to full protection with Nutanix files inside of Commvault Complete Backup and Recovery.
Yeah, you're certainly speaking something that our customers have always appreciated about Nutanix in general, and a key hallmark for files is simplicity. And it's what we've tried to do with Prism and making HCI easier to consume. So how does that look in this case for Commvault?
That's a good question. So for us, like I mentioned, it's pretty much a two-step process, right? First, you define the Nutanix cluster that's running the files environment, and we use that so our management engine can integrate directly with the files API, right? Make sure that we can run the operations needed to set up backup operations, to affect backup operations, and make sure all of that gets done in a timely manner. And then secondly, we define the environment logically so that we know what to protect, right? We can auto-discover the shares that exist. So as you add shares over time, each subsequent backup will simply find that new share, protect it with the existing infrastructure. Or alternatively, you can manually define everything if you need to be specific or you want to become more granular about what it is you're protecting inside of a share, right? And I'll show that in the demo in a little bit.
Yeah, simple, clean, and easy to use configuration options that don't overwhelm administrators is definitely what I think people want, particularly in the big data era. So that does seem really straightforward.
Yeah, that was definitely our intention, and we'll be refining this configuration as we continue to integrate. Today, it's all in the console, but we're moving very quickly to bring this to our command center, which is our streamlined web-based interface. So that's coming as well. And then, as mentioned before, the Commvault Data Protection Platform is scalable and flexible in a way that allows customers to choose how and where they want to protect their data, right? Whether they protect it on Commvault hyperscale or on Nutanix-based media agents, or really any media agents that exist in the environment today.
So you mentioned earlier, when talking about too big to fail, the traditional data protection operations are not efficient enough, or maybe another way of saying it is not capable of keeping up with the growth that we see in large data sets. And that's certainly something we see in customers building their environments with Nutanix files. How does Commvault manage this problem?
That's a great question. So traditional protection operations rely mostly on a combination of full backups with some number of incremental operations in between until you run another full traditional backup. And the big problem there is that the full backup has to scan through the entire data set and determine what it is that it's already protected. And it absolutely eats up the entire weekend usually for a backup window, if they're lucky. For some extremely large data sets, we've actually seen customers that still employ this methodology, moving to a quarterly backup, right? They'll schedule their full backup of their large data sets for just holiday weekends so that they can manage that 4 or 5 day backup process without really impacting the business. To say the least, this is pretty unsustainable to be forced to do that.
Yeah, I can imagine. So those extremely large data sets, I imagine figuring out what changed from one backup to the next is pretty time consuming.
They can be, that's for sure. But thanks to the Nutanix integration and the work that you guys have done, there's a change file tracking API that we're able to hook into that allows us to simply query the files environment and ask the system what has changed in a given period of time. These incrementals allow us to build out synthetic fulls, which simply say what data existed in a certain period of time. Let me show you what it looks like as of this moment. And then we can create synthetic fulls, which help drive down the full operation time, but it also integrates directly with that change file tracking, right? So what we've seen has been a tremendous benefit to us in order to be able to keep that incremental forever strategy going with a rolling full, right?
That makes sense. And we obviously put a lot of work into the CFT change file tracking technology for files, and we're really expecting some great performance improvements, particularly with large file sets where it can take a long time to scan the files. So what kinds of improvements have you seen in your testing with CFT and Commvault?
Yeah, that's pretty easily quantifiable. So in a couple of test scenarios we ran for a file share of a CIFS share in particular, we stuffed it full of about 1 million files and then changed roughly a third of them, so about 300,000 files, and ran an incremental without change file tracking enabled so that we could see simply what the baseline scan took. And that was about 45 minutes, which in the grand scheme of things doesn't seem like a lot until you compare it to the alternative. When we enabled CFT, we saw that scan time drop from 45 minutes down to 4.
Yeah, and what's interesting is you say 1 million files, and that's a great test scenario. I've got 1 million files on my Mac, and we're really talking about billions to trillions of files. So it's really, you've got to think about that 45 minutes or 4 minutes and think exponentially how big it is. And that's a huge improvement, very significant.
Yeah, it really is. And it gives all that time back to the actual data movement process, which is how customers are going to realistically meet their SLAs for data protection. In addition to the data movement and tiering options I mentioned earlier, Commvault Complete Backup and Recovery allows your data to be recovered securely in however or wherever you'd like, whether that's administrator-led recoveries or even self-service recoveries through our web portals. And then finally, being able to recover the data anywhere is critical, right? We mentioned before, being able to recover that data back from whole cloth is relatively difficult, but being able to put it back onto any restore target that you might have, whether that's a Windows or Linux server sitting around the environment, back in place to the original Nutanix share, some other Nutanix files environment, again, or even out to the cloud, right? Put it out to S3, put it out to Nutanix buckets, whichever vendor. Yep.
That makes sense. Hey, I do have a question. So you mentioned earlier about recovery of whole data sets, that can be challenging because of the size. Does Commvault have a solution to get around that situation, particularly where you have a primary site that's no longer available and individual file-based recovery would take too long to satisfy the RPO or the RTO requirements for a business?
Sure. We've actually got a couple of use cases that I wanted to talk about here at the end. The primary one is being able to simply export backup data that sits in our backup repositories via CIFS or NFS, right? So all of the data we've protected through Nutanix Files, we can simply respond back out to a disaster recovery event by providing back to the end user a CIFS share or an NFS share that they can access and use their data in the meantime while we're effecting a restore on the back end back to the original location. All right, so that can get around some of that too big to fail problem by making it just simply available all the time, whether it's from the replication perspective through Nutanix or it's from a Commvault share that is created from a backup set. And then finally, there's two other things I wanted to mention. One is there are a pair of data analysis tools. Right, the first is part of the base Commvault Complete Backup and Recovery solution, and it's Commvault File Analytics. And it's able to provide file insight, which easily tells you more about your file shares, right? It can give you information about how many files, how old are the files, who owns them, what kinds of files they are, and gives business owners and data owners the information they need to make critical decisions in optimizing their file shares, right? So they can make better decisions about how they're deploying and how they're utilizing that file system. And then you mentioned GDPR earlier. Commvault Activate is also another option that Commvault customers have, which is a powerful content-based search engine that can analyze not just the metadata as file analytics can, but it can dive deeply into each individual file within the file share, right, that we've protected. This is actually how we manage the GDPR solution that we released last year. And it can allow you to do simple things like identify all of the words in files, all the files that contain the words Commvault and Nutanix, for instance, in a given data set. Or it can do incredibly complicated things like finding personally identifiable information, rebate codes, credit card numbers, phone numbers, and so on, and allow administrators through that dashboard to take action upon whatever it is that has been found.
That's pretty comprehensive management. So I hear you might have a demo for us for the files integration.
I do. Let me switch over to that real quick. Hopefully this goes smoothly for everybody. Can everyone still see the, well, nobody can respond, so I'm going to assume.
we can see your screen.
Excellent. So I thought I would start out here within the Prism GUI. So you can see, it may be a little bit fuzzy for some of you, but you can see that there are a few file shares that have been created, some CIF shares, some NFS shares. And these are all from the Prism perspective, right? So this is how you would see them created on the Nutanix side. And then as we go through, here within Commvault, as I mentioned, there's just a couple of steps to manage, right? The first is the array management, and we use this to simply define what the Nutanix environment looks like. So we define what the cluster is, we define the REST API user that we need to be able to run all of the API commands, the API calls. And then once that is configured, we can use this information to seed the second step, which is the actual file share client itself, where we can discover the information about what's inside the share, we can protect the shares, and go through that as well. So here we've configured the Nutanix client, or the array client. And then we'll configure the Nutanix files agent itself, right? And so again, we provide the host name of the file share that we're going to be working with. We can choose whether or not we want to protect CIFS, NFS, or both, right? We can protect either with our current release. We simply choose the Nutanix array that we had configured earlier as part of array management. And then once that's created, we'll actually get that client to appear in our client list. And from here, we can go through, and if you're not familiar with Commvault, what we're doing is creating a subclient. That subclient is used to define what we're going to protect, where we're going to protect it, and through which proxies or hosts we're going to protect it through. So we'll simply browse the paths. And what you'll see is we browse through a particular node, right? So in this case, we're going to use a Windows file system server that has access to the Nutanix files environment. We're going to use a Active Directory enabled user in order to be able to validate the data that sits inside of the file share. And we can also use saved credentials here as well, so you don't necessarily have to have administrators poking this in every time. Once that's created, and we've done our browse config, we can see the file shares that existed before, right? So if you've got a really great memory, the list that you'll see here is actually the list that came from that Prism GUI earlier. And so we can have it either choose the entire share of the entire file server, or we can choose particular shares. And in this case, we're just going to choose a particular share and let it protect itself as it lingers on this for a minute. There we go. Okay. So then, as mentioned before, we use this to create the storage policy, which is where we do all of our tiering inside of. And then we have to tell it which data access nodes we're going to protect these file shares through. I'll pause here for a minute and mention earlier Commvault scaling, right? As your data set grows, you may need more horsepower to protect that. You simply scale that here, right, in your data access node. So if your data set continues to expand and you are, or your backup windows are starting to increase a little bit, you can just simply enable additional data access nodes, and we will dynamically start to break up the workload among the new nodes as we go. So it's not a one-size-fits-all solution. It depends on how much data you have and how much data you need to protect. Right? So for the purposes of the video, purposes of the test, we'll run an incremental, get that running in the background. We've previously run a number of fulls, in this case, so that we can show the recovery operations as well. But the backup phase is essentially we scan to figure out what's there, we move the data, and then we store that index I mentioned earlier that helps us know where things are. We'll browse through the full backup, and you can simply see the file share server, the share that we wanted to protect, and then all of the files and folders that existed inside of that file share at the time of the data protection operation. And it's pulling up all of that information from our dynamic index as we go, just live on the process. Move ahead a little bit. There we go. So then in order to restore, you can either choose entire folders or you can choose individual options, objects within that folder, and initiate the restore directly from here, right? This is the point at which administrators have the ability to choose which recovery platform they want to come from, whether that's on-prem, in the cloud. Do you want to restore it to the same place? Do you want to overwrite? Do you want to overwrite only if it's newer than the existing? So there's quite a bit of options here that you can go through in order to do your restores and make sure that those things are affected properly. And in this case, we're just going to restore to a test folder. Choose that demo restore folder. And fire off the recovery. So that should be relatively quick. So the restore is already running. The backup, of course, is still running, right? That incremental backup is still doing its file scan. This is a relatively short window, so it didn't finish yet. But as soon as that restore is done, we'll go back and take a look at the file system, that directory we created, and you'll see all those files we selected sitting there in the file system, right? And of course, that can go back to its original location on the file share. It can go back to a folder as we specified on just some random server. It can go to the cloud, wherever it needs to go, right? And so there is the directory structure that was restored and all of the directories on the inside of that file system, right? So let me go back over.
That's great, Sam. I think it really is clear that not only the configuration, but the backup and recovery process are super simple with Nutanix and Commvault all in one. So thanks for the demonstration and thanks for showing that. I want to close with a couple of ideas for folks. The first is there's a lot of different ways that Commvault and Nutanix work together, and we have a lot of materials that can help you understand that. One of the things that I'd like to close with is what you can do from here if you want to try this out. Commvault, a leader in data protection, Nutanix, a leader in HCI. We probably have a lot of customers on the call from both of those two technologies. And so today you can actually try Nutanix Files out on your Nutanix environment. You get 1 free terabyte with your cluster. If you're looking at Commvault and you don't use it currently, you can actually try that out today with a Commvault test drive. In both cases, just go to nutanix.com or commvault.com and you can learn more about that. And with that, I'll turn it over to Dave, who's going to do our drawing, and then we'll do Q&A.
Excellent presentation. I love the live demo as well. It's always good to see the product in action. So the winner of today's $300 Tango gift card is Ling Mao of North Carolina. Congratulations. We'll reach out to deliver your gift card. And with that, it's time for some Q&A. So if you're out there in the audience, you've been watching the demonstration and the presentation, you have some questions, now's the time to ask those questions because it's Q&A time. So let's see, first question that came in here, they're asking, and I'm not sure if this is for Devin or Sam, if I have snaps, clones, replication, and mirroring, why do I need backup? Does that become redundant?
Sounds like a Sam question.
It does sound like a Sam question. So it may seem a little redundant, but one of the things that the snaps and the clones and the mirroring doesn't get you is outside of the frame, right? That while it does seem unlikely that you're going to lose an entire frame and or the entire replica frame, it has happened in our 30-year history. It's not something that is an uncommon occurrence. I will admit that we probably aggregate a lot of data, so we probably see it more often than most people should. But it is something that happens. It is something to be concerned about. And then being able to really self-service that, right? So while having all of that done at the storage layer is, as an old storage guy myself, is super simple and it's super easy to manage from an administrator's perspective. Sometimes providing that data back out to end users or back out to compliance folks or really the business in general becomes a little more difficult, right? So if you've got processes to manage that, that's great. But what we find is typically that becomes a little bit difficult to manage at scale when you start to go through all that stuff.
Sam, I really liked your cars and insurance analogy that you used earlier, and it makes sense to me that in a car you might have a spare tire in case you get a flat, so you can change out your tire if you get a flat, but that doesn't protect you from an accident. If you have, if your battery dies, you've got jumper cables. So there are things that when you operate your car, you have ways to protect it, and the data center is not any different, right? There are things that you do for operational recovery. You have snaps and clones, you have replication, and they all have their different purposes. But ultimately, you buy insurance, and I don't know, Sam, if you like that analogy or not, but you buy insurance because there are times where you have major outages and you need major help and you need a major recovery. And it's also just peace of mind because you want to, you don't want to be the one holding the bag if something major happens. You want to have something you can rely on as a fallback. So your analogy made a lot of sense to me in that context.
Yep, and I would say in the last couple of years, the idea of the insurance policy has saved quite a number of our customers. At our Go conference last year, which we hosted in Nashville at the Gaylord, the chief operating officer of the Gaylord came out, and one of the things he said was we had a major virus event, right? We had a major issue, and one of the things he said was Commvault saved our bacon, right? Their production systems were taken down by viruses and by ransomware, and by having that air-gapped, not on the production system copy, they were able to recover their systems and get their business running and continue hotel operations, right? So they're two different things. They're two different sides of the same coin.
Yeah, air gap is a great point, right? I mean, if you have bad data, it doesn't matter if you're storing it off on the cloud, you're still replicating bad data out to the cloud. So that air gap where your data is protected by, an actual physical barrier, that really makes a big difference.
Yep, absolutely.
Great answers. All right. Let's see, another question that came in here. They're asking, what about skipping backups for fully replicated or snap NAS file systems? What's your take on that, Sam?
Well, as a backup guy, so I think it goes back to the previous question, which is really it comes down to how comfortable are you, right? And if that fully replicated, fully snapped solution meets your business needs and it solves the problems you're looking to solve, and it doesn't get you into any compliance issues, it doesn't get you into any regulation issues, then you're more than happy to continue that operation. But what we find is that typically, even in those cases, if the data set is exceptionally large, if the data set is exceptionally volatile, that even the replicated and the snap-based solutions are still potentially subject to those outside events, whether it's human error, whether it's a snap was dropped, whether it's a replication pair was ignored for a couple of days, whatever that might be, right? Humans occur all the time, and we're going to create problems for ourselves that we might need backup solutions for. So that's why we're here, right? Just to help you get out of your own mess.
I like that. Humans occur, like we're worst situation to be managed as well. But we are, right? I mean, human error, like you said, is a problem. You know, the thing about it, that when I was looking at this question, that when it came to the chat queue, what came to mind for me is it's a cost-benefit analysis, right? How much is that data worth to you? Is it changing so rapidly that you need to do it on an hourly basis, or on a, you know, with snaps and replication, or is it something that changes infrequently so that backup on a daily or even weekly basis is sufficient? And that too is why something like an incremental forever is a really smart technology to use, and in a way is like snapshot for backups, right? You only take a copy of the data that's changed over time, and it really reduces the load on your backup. So there's a lot of different technologies and ways to deal with that, so that you can get what you need without spending a lot and without using a lot of resources. But it really does come down to a cost-benefit analysis, I think.
All right, excellent. Let's see another question here that came in. They're asking, what are the deployment options for Commvault with Nutanix? Can it be deployed on the same HCI infrastructure or files infrastructure? And then I'll just add to that, if someone's interested, where do they purchase this solution from? Commvault or Nutanix, or both? How does that work?
Yeah, for the deployment side, I'll jump in there, it really is up to the end user, right? We can live on the files environment, right? There's typically some spare CPU there. There's typically a little bit of run what we need to run in order to be able to operate in that environment, but it's not required, right? So we can run within the Nutanix environment, we can run within a hyperscale, we can run on your own servers. If you have, you know, you've got existing servers or existing Commvault infrastructure in place, we can run on that. We can even run in the cloud, right? Depending on how your network configuration is and whether or not that bandwidth is sufficient. From a Commvault perspective, this is going to be covered under Commvault Complete Backup and Recovery. Everything I talked about is covered there, except for the Commvault Activate piece, which is a separate licensable component. But everything else is part of Commvault Complete Backup and Recovery. The trial that Devin mentioned earlier is available. It's on Commvault.com, just up in the upper right-hand corner. Just there's a free trial button you can choose there. And then from there, if you don't already have a local rep, that free trial option will give you access to Commvault resources if you're looking to purchase the product. All right, and I'll let Devin answer the Nutanix piece of that.
Yeah, absolutely. I think the key thing that you said there, or hinted at, is that flexibility is the key. Flexibility of how you deploy your data protection, if it's with files, if it's with your AOS environment, or if you do it as part of cloud or as part of other infrastructures. Flexibility is what people want. And that's what we try to support and deliver with Nutanix, for sure. In terms of how and where to purchase, this is sort of a meet in the market relationship. The Commvault Nutanix, both have their account reps and can help you as you need. So if you're looking at Nutanix files, if you're already a Nutanix customer, or if you're a net new customer and you're just looking for file storage, Nutanix files can serve that need. So definitely reach out to your Nutanix rep or reseller, and we can help you from there.
Okay, excellent. Let's see, another question here. What sort of targets does Commvault write to? Can I write to my HCI infrastructure if I want to use that for backup? And what are the benefits?
So I ran our consulting services organization for quite a number of years here at Commvault, and I will answer that question with a yes. So if you want to write us to a USB drive, that's fine. If you want to write us to the latest, greatest all-flash system, that's totally fine by us too. So we can consume, as I mentioned in the webinar, we can consume any media that we can write to easily. So if it's something that can be seen on a server, we can write to that, whether it's just a bunch of disk, whether it's object-based, so anything that's through an S3 interface we can access, whether it's on the back end of a files environment or an HCI environment like Nutanix, we have access to that disk as well. And then we can go all the way up through into the cloud on, depending on the cloud vendor, we can write to Glacier, we can write to regular traditional S3 or EBS or wherever else it needs to go. So, it's definitely a yes answer. You still got tape floating around out there, we were more than happy to put your Nutanix files data sitting on tape somewhere too. So.
Okay, excellent. Very flexible.
Indeed, that's for sure.
Another question I wanted to ask here for Devin, and that is, if someone out there has say it doesn't have to be an aging file server. It could just be an existing file server that they've never virtualized. I mean, can you kind of summarize the benefits of using Nutanix Files over a traditional file server solution?
Well, some of the biggest issues are around, the complexity of traditional file systems, right? So we talked a little bit about this in the presentation. What we see is often multiple types of file storage existing because people will purchase it on an ad hoc basis. And so where we're seeing consolidation is they might have a blank app, which I'm not going to say the name of, or take your heavy metal file system, and it's aging out, and they're getting at the time where they need to refresh, and that's typically what we see. And what they'll do is they'll take a lot of that and put it onto their HCI platform because it's just easier to manage everything from that single pane of glass. But not only that, once it's on there, management and upgrade becomes less disruptive, and in a lot of cases non-disruptive, because you're expanding it in the same way that your virtual environment expands. You're expanding your virtual storage, and you slap in a new node for additional capacity and additional CPUs, and that expands the performance and capacity linearly while not disrupting the work the work that your users are doing on top of that. When it's time to switch out, again, it's just switching out the nodes and upgrading them to the new nodes, or even just expanding new nodes as you go. So that's one of the big benefits. The second is Files offers both scale out and scale up, which usually you have to pick between the two in traditional heavy metal environments. And even in a lot of newer software-defined environments, that's not always available. And again, that's a non-disruptive scale out or scale up. So also a big benefit. The third that I would say is our emerging focus on intelligence, data intelligence, because as you go from a single administrator managing tens of terabytes to a single administrator managing tens of petabytes, that's scaling thousands of percent times of the amount that they have to manage. And so having an understanding of the data that exists on your infrastructure becomes so much more challenging. File analytics, our new feature for Nutanix Files, gives you so much data about how your data is being used, how it's being administrated, and more importantly, violations in accessing that data is really critical for people to be able to manage their data. And again, that's something integrated with Nutanix Files, which is pretty unique. So those are some of the areas that I think we offer some real differentiation in the file storage, and why people choose to go with Nutanix Files when they're deploying HCI and when they're looking for consolidation of their file storage.
Excellent, excellent. Well, it sounds like a lot of benefits to moving to Nutanix Files for a lot of companies out there, I'm sure, who are struggling with legacy file storage and heavy metal solutions, as you termed it. I like that. I think that's a great place to wrap up today's event. We've answered all the questions in the queue. Thank you so much, Devin and Sam, for being on the event today and presenting.
Thank you.
Thank you, David, and congratulations to Ling Mao for winning the card.
Absolutely, yeah. And thank you to our audience out there for joining us on today's event. I hope you learned a lot about the Nutanix File solution and the Commvault Complete Data Protection solution. For more information, of course, visit Nutanix.com and Commvault.com and check out those free trials that we talked about on today's event. Again, thanks for joining, and I hope everyone has a great day. Bye-bye.